At sunset, Karen smiled proudly as workers buried the old drainage ditch beside my property. She called it an eyesore, ruining the neighborhood's appearance. I warned her that ditch had protected the entire subdivision for decades, but she waived the permits she barely understood and threatened me with another HOA fine. Around midnight, spring rain arrived. By dawn, 3 luxury basements were underwater, including Karen's own. Standing knee-deep in filthy water, she demanded someone explain what happened. I quietly unfolded a faded engineering map dated 1983, and every face around her turned completely white. Ethan Brooks had lived a quiet life for most of his adult years, and quiet was exactly how he liked it. Before retirement, he had spent nearly 3 decades working as a hydraulic engineer for the county, designing and maintaining the drainage systems that kept entire neighborhoods from turning into lakes every time the mountains shed their winter weight. He understood water the way some men understood engines or numbers, not as an abstract force, but as a living thing with habits, moods, and a stubborn memory for the paths it had once been allowed to take. When he retired early, he chose a modest but comfortable house on the edge of a upscale Colorado subdivision, mostly because of the land behind it, a gently sloped stretch bordered by an old drainage ditch that ran the length of several properties before disappearing into a culvert beneath the county road. The ditch was not beautiful. It was overgrown in places, lined with rough stone, and cut a rugged scar across an otherwise manicured landscape. But Ethan understood something his neighbors did not, that the ditch was not a flaw in the design of the neighborhood, it was the design. It had been engineered decades earlier by people who understood exactly what happened when heavy snow melted fast and violent spring storms rolled down from the peaks, and it had done its job quietly and without complaint for more than 40 years. For most of that time, nobody thought about the ditch at all, which was precisely the point of good engineering, invisible until desperately needed. That anonymity ended the year Karen Whitmore became president of the Homeowners Association. Karen had moved into the neighborhood only a few years earlier, but she arrived with an outsized appetite for control and an unshakable belief that appearances were the truest measure of value. Within months of taking the position, she began issuing a stream of new rules that struck most residents as excessive at best and tyrannical at worst. Certain fence styles were banned. A narrow palette of approved paint colors was distributed like scripture. Recreational vehicles were no longer permitted in driveways, even temporarily. Lawns that grew even slightly taller than regulation height received warning notices taped to front doors. Karen wanted the neighborhood to look less like a collection of family homes and more like a 5-star resort, manicured to the point of sterility, and she pursued that vision with the zeal of someone who had never once considered that a landscape might have a purpose beyond how it photographed. Naturally, the drainage ditch behind Ethan's property became an early target of her disdain. To Karen, it was an ugly gash in the earth, an embarrassment that dragged down property values and clashed with the polished image she wanted the subdivision to project to potential buyers and to the wider world. She began mentioning it at every meeting, calling it an eyesore, a liability, a relic that no longer belonged in a community aspiring to prestige. Ethan tried, gently at first, to explain what the ditch actually was and why it mattered. But Karen had a talent for hearing only the parts of a conversation that confirmed what she already believed. She smiled through his explanations the way one might smile at a child insisting on an imaginary friend, polite, indulgent, and utterly unconvinced. Then one evening at a packed HOA meeting, standing at the podium with a stack of glossy landscaping brochures, Karen looked directly at Ethan and delivered the line that would echo through the neighborhood for months afterward. Next week, she announced, that ditch is going to disappear. Ethan had tried, more than once, to explain to Karen exactly what kind of neighborhood she had inherited stewardship over. He told her about the winter he arrived, back when he was still working for the county, and had personally reviewed the original subdivision plans before signing off on a routine maintenance permit. He remembered sitting at his kitchen table with the 1983 blueprints spread out before him, tracing the elevation lines with a pencil, marveling at how carefully the original engineers had accounted for every possible extreme. Snowpack levels drawn from decades of historical data, the compounding effect of warm rain falling on top of a rapid thaw, even the theoretical failure of the culvert beneath the county road during peak flow. He tried to convey some of that reverence to Karen during a quiet conversation on her porch one afternoon, hoping that if she understood the thinking behind the design, she might soften her opposition to its appearance. She had nodded along politely, sipping her sparkling water, and then changed the subject to an upcoming vote on whether mailbox posts needed to be replaced with a uniform-approved model. It was in that conversation that Ethan first understood, with a kind of quiet sadness, that Karen was not simply uninformed, she was uninterested, and there was a considerable difference between the two, because uninformed people could be taught, while uninterested people had already decided the lesson did not apply to them. Karen did not wait long to make good on her promise, and true to form, she skipped every step that might have slowed her down. She never contacted the county drainage department. She never requested the original engineering surveys that were sitting, fully accessible, in the public records office downtown. She certainly never asked Ethan, the one person on the entire street with direct professional expertise in exactly this kind of infrastructure, for his opinion on what she was about to do. Instead, she hired a private landscaping crew, paid them handsomely from the HOA's discretionary fund, and set them loose on the property line behind Ethan's house with instructions to fill in the unsightly trench and redirect whatever water it carried toward a neighboring undeveloped lot that Karen considered a more appropriate dumping ground for something so unglamorous. When Ethan came out to see trucks rumbling along the easement and workers already dumping loads of fill dirt into the channel, he felt a cold, familiar dread settle into his stomach, the specific dread of a man watching someone casually dismantle a safety system without understanding what it was protecting. He approached the crew foreman first, then called Karen directly, laying out in plain, careful language exactly what that ditch was engineered to do. He explained that it was not merely a drainage feature, but the subdivision's primary emergency overflow channel, calculated decades earlier based on the slope of the land, the volume of spring runoff from higher elevations, and the statistical probability of extreme rainfall events. He explained that redirecting the water without proper engineering analysis would not make the water disappear. It would simply relocate the pressure, and relocated pressure in hydraulic systems rarely stayed politely contained where you wanted it. Karen listened to perhaps half of what he said before, waving a folder of permits she had barely skimmed and telling him, with the breezy confidence of someone who had never once been wrong in her own mind, that water would simply find its own way. When Ethan pressed further, refusing to simply accept an answer that violated every principle he had spent his career mastering, Karen's patience evaporated entirely. 2 days later, an official HOA violation notice appeared on his door, citing him for failing to cooperate with community landscaping improvements, along with a fine that felt less like a penalty and more like a warning shot. The work continued through the following week. Fill dirt went in. The historic channel, stone-lined and time-tested, vanished beneath fresh soil that had not been properly compacted, an oversight that any competent engineer would have flagged immediately as a serious risk. The rerouted water was pointed instead toward a shallow, unprepared depression on the adjacent lot, a solution that addressed nothing structural and simply moved the eventual problem a few hundred feet to the left. Meanwhile, the local news had begun running segments about an approaching weather system, the kind of announcement people tended to only half listen to during the transitional weeks between winter and spring. Meteorologists were using words like historic and once in a century, describing a collision of rapid snowmelt from an unusually heavy winter with an incoming storm system expected to dump several inches of rain across the region within a single overnight window. Ethan heard the forecast and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather itself and everything to do with what now sat, freshly filled and utterly unprepared, directly behind his house. The rain arrived exactly as predicted, gently at first, the kind of soft evening drizzle that made porch lights glow and turned sidewalks a deep, reflective black. Ethan sat by his back window that night watching the sky, the way a man watches something he already knows is coming for him. Within a few hours, the gentle patter shifted into something heavier, a steady, relentless downpour accompanied by distant rolling thunder that seemed to be circling the valley rather than passing through it. Snowmelt from the surrounding hillsides, already saturated from weeks of warming temperatures, began adding its volume to the falling rain, creating exactly the kind of runoff surge the old ditch had been built to absorb and channel safely away. Except the old ditch no longer existed. In its place sat compacted fill dirt and a redirected flow path that had never been tested, never been calculated, and was about to be asked to perform a job it was never designed to handle. Ethan pulled up the security cameras mounted along the back of his property, the same cameras he had installed years earlier out of simple habit, an engineer's instinct for documentation. On the small glowing screen, he watched water begin pooling where the ditch used to run, rising steadily as it searched for an outlet that no longer existed. He picked up his phone and began making calls, first to the city's emergency line, then to the Public Works Department's after-hours number, then finally to the fire department's non-emergency dispatch, describing in precise professional terms exactly what was happening and exactly what he feared was coming. He recorded video on his phone as well, careful, methodical footage of the rising water and the freshly disturbed earth where the ditch once ran, the instinct of a man who understood that in situations like this, evidence mattered more than outrage. 2 streets over, In a house that had recently received a fresh coat of HOA-approved paint, Karen Whitmore slept soundly, entirely unaware that the water she had dismissed so easily was already beginning to rise against the boundaries she had redrawn without asking anyone who actually understood what those boundaries meant. Ethan stayed awake through the worst of it, unwilling to simply trust that a problem of this magnitude might somehow resolve itself while he slept. He pulled on his boots and a heavy rain jacket and walked the perimeter of his own property with a flashlight, watching the water climb steadily up the freshly disturbed earth where the ditch had once carried everything safely away. He noted, with the detached precision of a man trained to measure exactly these kinds of things, how quickly the water was rising, faster than any natural flooding he had witnessed in his years working for the county, because natural flooding had somewhere to go, while this water had nowhere at all. It pooled and spread and searched, testing every low point along the property line, patient in the way that water was always patient, indifferent to schedules, indifferent to homeowners association bylaws, indifferent to anyone's opinion about what a neighborhood ought to look like. He thought about calling Karen directly one more time, standing there in the rain with his phone in his hand. But he already knew from painful experience exactly how that conversation would go, and he decided his time was better spent documenting what was happening than arguing with someone who had never once been willing to listen. By around 2 a.m, the water had found its first victim. It crept silently across a low point in the neighboring yard, pooling at the base of a garage door before beginning to seep beneath it, dark and cold and utterly indifferent to the granite countertops and imported tile waiting inside. Within the hour, that same water had found a second path, slipping along a poorly graded slope toward a basement window while 2 houses down, filling it slowly until pressure finally cracked the seal and sent a thin, steady stream pouring into a finished basement full of furniture, electronics, and framed family photographs. By 3 a.m, a third home joined the growing catastrophe, water rising through floor drains that had never been designed to handle reverse pressure from a redirected flood channel. Luxury vehicles parked in lower-level garages began to float, gently at first, and then with unsettling buoyancy, bumping against walls as the water climbed higher. Furniture warped, drywall darkened and swelled. In one home, a backup generator, meant to be the last line of defense against exactly this kind of emergency, sputtered, sparked, and died as water finally reached its housing. Karen woke to the sound of her own basement alarm screaming through the house, and when she ran downstairs in her robe, she found several inches of murky water already swallowing the bottom steps. She waded out through her own flooded garage in a panic, shouting into the rain, demanding to know who was responsible for this, as though the storm itself owed her an explanation. Ethan stood at the edge of his property, already soaked, watching the water continue to rise around homes that had trusted a system Karen had dismantled without a single consultation. When she spotted him standing there, calm and silent in the downpour, she screamed the question directly at him, demanding to know who was responsible. And for a long moment, Ethan said absolutely nothing at all. He simply looked at the water, then looked at her, and let the silence answer a question that both of them already knew the truth of. Dawn arrived gray and reluctant, the storm finally tapering into a persistent drizzle that seemed almost apologetic compared to the devastation of the night before. A white city truck rolled slowly down the flooded street not long after sunrise, and Mark Ellis, the county's senior building inspector, stepped out into ankle-deep water with a clipboard already growing damp in his hands. He moved methodically from yard to yard, crouching at the edge of the filled-in ditch, running his fingers through the freshly disturbed soil, noting immediately that it showed no signs of proper compaction, no engineering stamp, no evidence of permitting whatsoever. He asked the small crowd of shivering, furious homeowners who had authorized this work, and every eye in the group turned toward Karen, who stood at the edge of her own ruined driveway, arms crossed, insisting over and over that she had simply been trying to improve the appearance of the community. Mark asked her plainly who had signed off on redirecting a documented drainage channel, and Karen's confident facade finally cracked, her mouth opening and closing without producing an actual answer. Mark worked his way further down the property line, photographing the exposed cross-section where water had already begun eroding the freshly dumped fill, and made careful note of the absence of any compaction testing records, any geotechnical assessment, any of the routine documentation that accompanied even minor grading work within the county. He had seen plenty of homeowners association disputes over the years, arguments about fences and paint colors and the precise acceptable height of ornamental grasses, but he rarely encountered a situation where an unelected volunteer board had taken it upon itself to unilaterally alter a documented flood control structure without so much as a phone call to his office. He asked again, more firmly this time, whether anyone present could produce a permit, and when the silence stretched on a beat too long, he simply exhaled slowly, and began writing out the first of what would eventually become a lengthy stack of citations. It was David Sloan, the oldest resident on the street, and a man who had watched the neighborhood grow up around him for more than 30 years, who stepped forward with a manila folder tucked protectively under one arm. Inside were photographs he had taken weeks earlier, back when a few residents had first grumbled about Karen's plans for the ditch, images that clearly showed the original channel intact, stone-lined and functioning, along with informal notes he had kept describing conversations in which Karen dismissed every warning about the ditch's true purpose. David had lived through enough neighborhood disputes to know that documentation mattered more than memory, and his quiet foresight was about to prove more valuable than anyone at that soggy, exhausted gathering could yet appreciate. He had moved into the subdivision back when the last of the original construction crews were still finishing punch list items on the far side of the development, and he remembered, with surprising clarity for a man well into his 60s, the year the county had come through and performed a full inspection of the drainage system after a smaller storm caused minor flooding on a street 2 neighborhoods over. He remembered the inspector at the time explaining to a small group of curious residents exactly why the ditch behind what would eventually become Ethan's house existed at all, describing it as the pressure valve of the entire subdivision, the one place engineered specifically to take on excess water so that every other yard, every other basement, every other garage could remain dry. David had never forgotten that conversation, filing it away the way people file away pieces of information that seem interesting but not urgent, until suddenly, decades later, it became the most urgent thing he knew. Mark studied the photographs carefully, his expression darkening with each new image, and then he turned back toward Ethan, asking whether he had any additional information about what this drainage system had originally been designed to accomplish. That was the moment Ethan finally reached into the waterproof folder he had carried out with him that morning and withdrew a set of aged, slightly yellowed engineering plans, dated in careful draftsman lettering to 1983. He unfolded them carefully on the hood of Mark's truck, smoothing out decades-old creases to reveal detailed cross-sections, elevation calculations, and flow rate projections that had guided the original construction of the neighborhood's entire stormwater system. Ethan explained, in the same calm, methodical tone he had used the very first time he tried to warn Karen that when this subdivision was originally developed, its engineers had calculated everything: average snowmelt volumes, historical rainfall extremes, worst-case runoff scenarios drawn from decades of regional weather data. The ditch behind his house had never been an accident or an oversight. It had been deliberately designed and formally designated as the neighborhood's primary emergency overflow channel, a critical piece of infrastructure, explicitly protected from modification, without full engineering review and municipal approval. Karen stared at the unfolded plans as though they were written in a language she had never learned to read, which in a sense they were, because she had never once bothered to request the county's original development records before deciding to bury 40 years of careful engineering beneath a truckload of decorative fill dirt. Lisa Morgan, a member of the city council who had been contacted overnight due to the scale of the flooding and had arrived just in time to hear Ethan's explanation, confirmed everything he said within minutes, pulling identical historical records up on a tablet connected to the county's digital archive. The overflow designation was there in black and white, cross-referenced with easement agreements, drainage covenants, and explicit language prohibiting exactly the kind of unauthorized modification that had just occurred. Lisa's expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to disbelief as she paged through document after document confirming that every protection Karen had ignored had been sitting in public records the entire time, fully accessible to anyone who simply thought to look. Word of the disaster spread through the subdivision within hours, and by early afternoon, insurance adjusters in rain slickers were picking through waterlogged basements alongside a small parade of lawyers who seemed to have materialized almost as quickly as the floodwater itself. The insurance companies representing the 3 flooded households moved fast, and their conclusions were uniformly, devastatingly consistent, that the damage had resulted from an unauthorized, unpermitted alteration to a protected drainage structure, and that such damage fell squarely outside standard coverage for what would otherwise have been classified as a natural flooding event. Claims were denied, one after another, leaving 3 families staring down renovation costs that easily reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars combined, costs that no ordinary homeowner's policy had ever been designed to absorb. Karen's confident demeanor from the night before had entirely collapsed by the time the first denial letter arrived at her own address, replaced by a mounting, visible panic as she realized just how personally exposed she had become. The 3 affected families spent that first week in a daze of hotel rooms, restoration company estimates, and increasingly frustrating phone calls with insurance representatives who kept repeating variations of the same sentence, that the damage appeared to stem from a man-made alteration rather than a covered natural event, and that further investigation would be required before any claim could move forward. One family, the Coopers, had only finished renovating their basement into a home theater the previous autumn, and stood in the wreckage of soaked carpeting and warped drywall calculating losses that stretched into six figures before repairs had even begun. Another homeowner, an older widow named Patricia Reyes, who lived 2 doors down from Karen, wept openly at the emergency meeting when she described watching 4 decades of family photographs, stored in cardboard boxes in her basement, dissolve into an unrecognizable pulp overnight. It was Patricia's tears, more than any spreadsheet of damages, that seemed to finally turn the tide of neighborhood sentiment fully and irreversibly against Karen, because numbers could be negotiated and disputed, but nobody could argue with the particular grief of losing something that could never be replaced. Within days, formal legal action began taking shape. The 3 affected families filed suit against the Homeowners Association as an entity, against Karen individually in her capacity as the person who had authorized the unpermitted work, and against the landscaping company that had performed the excavation without ever requesting proof of proper permitting. The HOA itself began fracturing almost immediately under the pressure, its board splitting into bitter factions, some members scrambling to distance themselves from Karen's decisions, while others quietly began circulating a petition demanding her immediate removal. Group messaging threads that once carried polite reminders about holiday decorations filled instead with copies of Karen's earlier dismissive remarks about the ditch, forwarded again and again by furious residents demanding accountability. As engineers and contractors assessed the full scope of the damage over the following week, the estimated total cost of repairs, remediation, and structural restoration climbed past $600,000, a number that seemed to grow larger and more suffocating every time it appeared in another email chain. The Homeowners Association called an emergency general meeting the following week, and attendance shattered every previous record in the community's history, with residents packing not just every available seat but lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway of the rented community center. Someone had compiled security footage from several properties along the street, stitching together the events of that catastrophic night, and the video was projected onto a large screen at the front of the room for everyone to witness together. There, captured in unmistakable clarity, was Karen instructing the landscaping crew days earlier, her voice calm and dismissive as she told them simply to fill in the ditch and be done with it, completely indifferent to a worried worker who could be heard on the recording asking whether they should check with the county first. Karen tried, weakly, to argue that the footage had been taken out of context, but there was no context capable of softening the plain meaning of her own recorded words, and the room's collective mood shifted from anger into something colder and far more final. A younger board member named Jason Carter, who had voted alongside Karen on nearly every decision throughout her tenure, stood up near the back of the room and admitted, in a voice that trembled slightly, that he had raised concerns about the ditch project privately weeks earlier and had been told by Karen that the paperwork was already handled and there was nothing left to discuss. His admission landed heavily across the room, another small brick added to a wall of evidence that made it increasingly difficult for anyone to imagine a version of events where Karen had simply made an honest, forgivable mistake. Several residents who had initially felt sympathy for her, reasoning that anyone could make an error in judgment, found that sympathy curdling into something closer to disbelief, as each new detail confirmed that this had never been a single lapse, but a pattern of decisions made in defiance of every warning she received. As the meeting continued, additional evidence emerged that made any remaining defense entirely impossible to sustain. Email correspondence between Karen and the landscaping company confirmed that she had explicitly instructed them to skip formal permitting in order to save time and expedite the project before an upcoming HOA inspection tour. Text messages, subpoenaed as part of the mounting lawsuits and shared with board members ahead of the meeting, showed Karen mocking Ethan's original warnings in private conversations with a friend, dismissing him at one point as a paranoid retired engineer who simply needed to relax. Contracts confirmed that Karen had personally approved payment for the unauthorized work using HOA discretionary funds, without ever bringing the decision to a formal board vote as required by the association's own governing bylaws. Every piece of evidence, gathered independently and pointing in the exact same direction, made it unmistakably clear that this had never been a simple accident, but the direct, foreseeable consequence of one woman's decision to prioritize appearance over expertise and control over caution. At the end of that long, exhausting meeting, the board called for an immediate vote of no confidence, and the outcome was neither close nor merciful. Karen Whitmore was removed from the presidency on the spot, and within the same session, the board voted unanimously to bar her from holding any leadership position within the association ever again. The landscaping company, facing its own share of the mounting lawsuits, quickly moved to shift blame back onto Karen, producing internal records showing that their crew had explicitly raised concerns about missing permits before beginning the work, concerns Karen had waved away with the same breezy confidence she had shown Ethan from the very beginning. City officials, working alongside Lisa Morgan's office, issued a formal order requiring full restoration of the original drainage channel, according to the specifications laid out in the 1983 engineering plans, with all costs to be covered through litigation, rather than passed on to the broader community. Ethan, despite everything he had endured, chose not to walk away once the immediate crisis had passed. He volunteered his professional expertise to the restoration project entirely without charge, working directly with the city's engineering team to not only rebuild the original channel but to genuinely improve upon it, incorporating modern flow calculations, updated materials, and a small supplementary retention basin designed to handle even more extreme rainfall events than the original 1983 plans had ever anticipated. Neighbors who had barely spoken to him before the disaster began stopping by regularly, offering coffee, thanking him quietly for the calm, methodical persistence that had ultimately protected far more of the street than most people initially realized. He spent several weekends walking the length of the property line with the city's engineering team, comparing the original 1983 specifications against modern rainfall modeling data, explaining patiently why certain calculations needed updating to reflect changes in regional weather patterns over the past 4 decades. He suggested widening the channel by nearly a third in its narrowest section, a modification the original engineers had never needed to consider because the storms of their era had simply never demanded it, and he pushed for the addition of a secondary retention basin further up the slope, a feature that would catch and slow the very first surge of runoff before it ever reached the main channel at all. The city engineers, impressed by both his technical fluency and his complete lack of interest in taking any credit for the work, began deferring to his judgment on nearly every design decision, occasionally joking that the county should simply rehire him, an offer Ethan always declined with a small, tired smile, explaining that he had already spent 30 years doing exactly this and had earned the right to simply enjoy watching someone else stress over the permitting paperwork. Karen, meanwhile, found herself facing not only the collapse of her HOA leadership, but a wave of personal lawsuits that her homeowner's insurance flatly refused to help cover, since the damage stemmed directly from her own unauthorized decisions rather than any accident. Within a matter of months, unable to bear the financial pressure or the weight of a neighborhood that no longer trusted her judgment about anything, she quietly listed her house for sale and left the community altogether. Her attorney, during one of the many mediation sessions that eventually followed, reportedly advised her that her strongest defense would have simply been admitting fault early and cooperating fully with the affected families. But Karen resisted that advice for weeks, insisting instead that she had acted in good faith and could not have reasonably foreseen the consequences of her decision. That argument collapsed entirely once the mediator reviewed the same text messages the board had already seen, messages in which Karen mocked Ethan's professional warnings and explicitly instructed her landscaping crew to move quickly before anyone could formally object. By the time she finally agreed to a settlement, the figure attached to her name had grown substantially beyond the original repair estimates, swollen further by legal fees, mediation costs, and the sheer volume of hours attorneys on both sides had spent combing through a paper trail that Karen herself had unwittingly created. Neighbors who watched the moving truck pull away from her driveway on a quiet Tuesday morning that summer said very little to each other, not out of malice, but because there seemed to be nothing left worth saying that the moving truck itself did not already say more eloquently. By the time summer settled fully over the valley, the transformation along the back of Ethan's property was almost unrecognizable, though not in the way Karen had once imagined. The restored drainage channel now ran wider and deeper than before, lined with carefully placed natural stone that both stabilized the banks and softened its appearance, bordered by native grasses and drought-resistant plantings chosen specifically because their root systems helped reinforce the soil against erosion. It managed the rare, elegant trick of being both genuinely beautiful and structurally superior to anything that had existed there before, proof that function and appearance had never actually been enemies, only badly misunderstood by someone unwilling to learn the difference. The homeowners association that emerged from the wreckage of that spring operated under an entirely new philosophy, one built around transparency, mandatory consultation with licensed professionals before any infrastructure changes, and strict limits on unilateral authority for any single board member, regardless of how confident or persuasive they seemed. Lisa Morgan, drawing on what she had witnessed during the aftermath, helped the new board draft a set of bylaws requiring any modification to shared infrastructure to first pass through an independent engineering review, with findings presented openly at a general meeting before any vote could even be scheduled. The new board president, a soft-spoken civil engineer named Rachel Dawson, who had lived quietly on the street for years without ever seeking a leadership role, made a point of inviting Ethan to every meeting that touched on drainage, landscaping, or infrastructure, not because the bylaws required it, but because she had watched what happened when expertise was dismissed in favor of confident opinion, and she had no intention of repeating that mistake. Meetings that once revolved around paint colors and fence heights now occasionally featured presentations on soil composition and runoff coefficients, and while a few residents grumbled good-naturedly about how technical things had become, nobody seriously suggested returning to the old way of doing business. The Coopers eventually rebuilt their basement theater, though this time they insisted on a sump pump system with battery backup and a secondary drainage line that Ethan helped them design during a series of casual Saturday morning conversations over coffee. Patricia Reyes, the widow who had lost decades of family photographs, found an unexpected comfort in the months that followed when several neighbors, without being asked, began quietly compiling digital scans of old community events and shared memories, an informal gift that could never replace what she lost but seemed, in its own modest way, to acknowledge it. The third affected family, a young couple who had only closed on their house the previous autumn, used part of their eventual settlement to install a modest greenhouse where their flooded garage once stood, a small act of transformation that felt, to those who noticed it, like a quiet refusal to let one catastrophic night define the property forever. Slowly, through the ordinary rhythms of repair crews and insurance paperwork and casual driveway conversations, the neighborhood began remembering what it had been before Karen arrived, a place where people looked out for each other not because a set of bylaws demanded it, but because it simply made sense. One warm evening, David Sloan stood beside Ethan near the newly finished channel, watching a gentle trickle of runoff move smoothly along its new stone-lined path exactly as it was designed to. David chuckled quietly, shaking his head, and remarked that it was funny how the ugliest thing on the whole street had turned out to be the very thing that saved it. Ethan said nothing for a long moment, simply watching the water move the way it was always meant to move. Unhurried, contained, entirely at peace with the boundaries built to guide it. Nobody on that street called the ditch an eyesore anymore, not after everything it had proven about the quiet, unglamorous value of expertise, patience, and a plan drawn up decades earlier by people who understood something Karen Whitmore had refused to learn until it cost her almost everything she had. Long after the lawsuits settled and the last insurance check finally cleared, Ethan would still find himself walking out to the edge of his property whenever a storm rolled in, not out of anxiety anymore, but out of something closer to quiet satisfaction, the particular pleasure of watching a well-designed system perform exactly the function it was built for. He had spent nearly 30 years of his professional life designing infrastructure that most people would never think about, never thank him for, and never even notice unless it failed. And there had been moments during his career when that anonymity felt like a small kind of loneliness. But standing there in the rain, watching the new channel carry water smoothly and safely past 3 homes that had once nearly lost everything, he understood that this particular kind of invisibility was not a failure to be noticed. It was the entire point. The best infrastructure, like the best kind of care, rarely announced itself, and only revealed its true value in the exact moment someone foolish enough tried to remove it. In the end, the entire ordeal became something of a quiet lesson passed between neighbors for years afterward, a reminder shared over fences and driveway conversations whenever someone floated an ambitious new idea for changing the neighborhood. Nature, it turned out, held no particular respect for confidence or control, and no amount of glossy landscaping brochures or dismissive waves of the hand could talk floodwater into behaving differently than physics and gravity demanded. A single arrogant decision, made without consultation and without humility, had been enough to erase hundreds of thousands of dollars in value across 3 homes within the span of a single overnight storm, while genuine knowledge, patience, and respect for systems built before you arrived remained the only foundation sturdy enough to support a real community. Ethan Brooks never sought credit for what he had done, never wanted the attention that followed, and continued tending his modest yard exactly as he always had. But every time it rained heavily after that, his neighbors found themselves glancing instinctively toward the quiet stone channel running behind his house, grateful, at last, for the unglamorous thing that had never once stopped protecting them. Years later, when new families moved into the subdivision and asked why the drainage channel looked so deliberately designed compared to the plain grass and decorative shrubs found elsewhere in the neighborhood, Longtime residents would tell the story the way stories eventually settle into local legend, softened at the edges but never losing its essential shape, about a woman who tried to erase something she never understood, and a quiet man who simply refused to let her. It became, in its own small way, the defining lesson of that particular corner of Colorado, passed down not through any formal record, but through the ordinary conversations neighbors have while watching rainfall, a reminder that the things built to protect people rarely look impressive, and that the people who understand them best are rarely the ones shouting the loudest at any given meeting.